Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're looking into some really fascinating research. It's coming out of Spain,
That's right.
and it involves brain scans of people who hold authoritarian beliefs. But the interesting thing here, the thing that makes it stand out, is that it actually tries to separate out left-wing and right-wing authoritarianism.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not treating it as just one thing. This was published in Neuroscience by researchers at the University of Zaragoza.
Okay.
And like you said, they used MRI scans, brain scans on about 100 young adults. And then they looked at those scans alongside how these people answered questionnaires.
Questionnaires about not just politics, I assume.
No, they covered authoritarian tendencies, sure, both right and left,
Mm.
but also things like anxiety, impulsivity, emotionality in general, trying to get a broader psychological profile.
Got it. Okay, so let's try and unpack this. The main takeaway, the sort of headline finding, seems to be that they found actual neurological differences.
Yes. Differences in brain regions we know are involved in, well, social reasoning, how we think about others, and also emotional regulation.
And these differences showed up when comparing people with these authoritarian beliefs to those who were, let's say, more centrist.
Precisely, compared to the middle ground folks. So our mission here is really to dig into these findings, look at the distinctions they found between left and right authoritarian brain structures, and, think about what these differences might actually suggest.
Okay, sounds good. Where should we start? Maybe with the right-wing authoritarianism side. How did the study define that?
Sure. So for right-wing authoritarianism, the definition they use focused on adherence to conservative ideas, traditional values, that kind of thing.
Right.
And also, importantly, advocating for punitive measures for social control.
Okay, so a focus on tradition, maybe conformity, and a strong law and order stance. And the brain scans. What popped out for this group?
Well, the key finding here was lower gray matter volume, specifically in the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex.
The dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Okay, that's a mouthful. What does that bit of the brain usually handle?
So, according to the lead author, and this is a direct quote, it's a region involved in understanding others' thoughts and perspectives.
Ah, okay. So like putting yourself in someone else's shoes.
Yeah.
Mental perspective taking.
Exactly that. Trying to figure out what someone else might be thinking or intending. That kind of social calculation.
So if people leaning towards right-wing authoritarianism showed less gray matter volume there, what are the potential implications? Does that suggest something about how they interact socially or process different viewpoints?
Well, that's the connection the research suggests, isn't it? If that
Yeah.
region has lower volume, maybe it's linked to less capacity or inclination for that kind of perspective taking.
Which could potentially contribute to seeing things in a more rigid way, less openness to other viewpoints.
Potentially. Might make it harder to fully grasp why someone holds a different view, leading to more sticking with one's own group or ideology. It's a correlation, of course, but an interesting one.
Yeah, definitely thought-provoking. Okay, so that's one side. Let's pivot to the other group they looked at. Left-wing authoritarians. How is that defined in the study?
Right, so the definition here was quite different. They described left-wing authoritarians as those interested in, and I'm quoting again, violently overthrowing and penalizing the current structures of authority and power in society.
Okay, wow. So much more focused on radical, even forceful change against the existing system. A very
Yeah.
different goal set.
Very different, yes.
And the neurological findings, did they see different patterns in this group compared to the right-wing authoritarians?
They did. The main thing they highlighted was less cortical thickness.
Yeah.
So the outer layer of the brain in a region called the right anterior insula.
Right, anterior insula. Okay.
Yeah.
And its job, what's that area associated with?
Well, the study and other research connected with emotional empathy and behavioral inhibition.
Emotional empathy, like feeling what others feel. And behavioral inhibition, stopping yourself from acting.
Pretty much. The insula generally is involved in processing internal bodily states, gut feelings, emotions. And this specific part, the right anterior insula, seems particularly linked to emotional awareness, empathy, and also that sense of disgust, like moral disgust. And, yeah, putting the brakes on impulsive actions.
Okay, that's fascinating because they also mentioned links to meditation and moral disgust in the article, didn't they?
Yes, exactly. Greater thickness has been linked to things like meditation practice, potentially reflecting better emotional regulation, and also stronger reactions of moral disgust.
So if the left-wing authoritarians in this study showed less thickness there, what might that point towards?
It raises questions, doesn't it? Could less thickness relate to maybe a different way of processing emotional empathy? Perhaps less resonance with the feelings of those upholding the status quo they oppose?
Or maybe relate to the behavioral inhibition part. Perhaps a reduced capacity to suppress strong emotional reactions or actions aimed at disrupting the system.
That's certainly a possibility the findings suggest. It hints at potential differences in emotional processing and impulse control compared to the other groups.
It really highlights how these aren't just, two sides of the same coin neurologically. They seem to have distinct correlates.
Very distinct based on this data.
But were there any commonalities? Did the questionnaires reveal anything that both left-wing and right-wing authoritarians shared?
Yes, actually. Despite the different neurological findings, there was a key psychological trait they found in common.
Okay.
Both groups tended to act impulsively in emotionally negative situations.
Ah, okay. So when things get emotionally charged and negative, both groups might be quicker to react without thinking it through as much.
That seems to be the pattern suggested by the questionnaire data. A kind of shared impulsivity when upset or feeling threatened, perhaps.
Interesting. But was everything else shared emotionally?
No, there was another difference noted. The data indicated that the left-wing authoritarians tended to report being more anxious overall.
More anxious than the right-wing group? Or more anxious than the centrists?
More anxious than both the right-wing authoritarians and the more centrist participants, according to their self-reports.
Okay, so a shared tendency towards impulsivity when feeling negative, but potentially a higher baseline level of anxiety for those on the left-wing authoritarian side. That adds another layer of complexity.
It really does. And, it's probably worth stressing how novel this study seems to be.
In what way?
Well, the authors suggest it's likely the first time research has specifically looked for and found different neurological correlates for left-wing versus right-wing authoritarianism.
Mm.
Often in the past, authoritarianism was studied more as a single concept.
Right, sort of lumped together. Why is making that distinction important now, do you think?
Well, think about the broader context.
Hmm.
The study author actually notes this. It's a fascinating look, they say, into the brains of people with extremist views, especially, and this is their phrase, as their ilk sees power worldwide.
That's a strong statement.
It is. But it highlights the relevance. If we're seeing rises in different kinds of extremist or authoritarian movements, understanding that they might have different psychological and even neurological underpinnings could be really important.
Yeah, it suggests maybe a one-size-fits-all approach to understanding or countering these views might not work if the roots are different.
Exactly. It could inform how we approach dialogue or policy or intervention, perhaps needing different strategies depending on the specific form of authoritarian belief system we're encountering.
That makes sense. But we absolutely have to add the caveat, right? The researchers themselves are clear on this.
Oh, absolutely crucial. This study shows correlations, not causation.
Meaning?
Meaning we see these brain differences alongside these beliefs, but we don't know if the brain differences came first and predisposed people to the beliefs, or if holding strong beliefs over time might actually influence brain structure, or if maybe some third factor like life experiences or genetics influences both.
Right. So correlation doesn't equal causation, a classic reminder in science.
Always worth repeating. This is a snapshot, a really intriguing one. But it's not the whole story of how these beliefs form or why they persist. It's just one piece.
Okay. So let's try and wrap this up for you, the listener. We've dug into this Spanish study, and it suggests potential links between right-wing authoritarianism and lower gray matter in a part of the brain tied to understanding others' perspectives, that dorsomedial prefrontal cortex.
Right. And for left-wing authoritarianism, the link was to less cortical thickness in the right anterior insula, an area involved in emotional empathy and maybe controlling impulsive behavior.
But interestingly, both groups seem to share a tendency to act impulsively when experiencing negative emotions.
Yes, that was a shared psychological trait they found. Though the left-wing group also reported, on average, higher levels of anxiety.
So it really does paint a more nuanced picture than just authoritarianism. It suggests there might be different pathways, different underlying profiles.
Exactly. This kind of research challenges us to move beyond simple labels and consider these potential, quite distinct neurological and psychological patterns associated with different ways of holding strong, authoritarian-leaning beliefs.
It definitely does. And maybe a final thought to leave you with. Considering these potential neurological correlates again, without excusing or validating harmful beliefs or actions, how might this kind of understanding subtly shift how we approach conversations or interactions?
Yeah, if we understand there might be differences in perspective-taking ability or emotional regulation or anxiety levels potentially at play, Does that change anything?
Does it open up new questions for you about what drives these deep-seated beliefs and what kind of further research might help us understand them better? Something to think about until our next deep dive.